Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film, and what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? This episode looks at two films that examine the environmental disaster at Minamata, Japan. Noriaki Tsuchimoto's documentary, Minamata, Their Victims and the World, from 1971, and Andre Levitas's Minamata, from 2020, a Hollywood feature film that tells the story through the famous American photographer W. Eugene Smith. From 1932 to 68, the Chisso Corporation, a local petrochemical and plastics maker, dumped approximately 27 tons of mercury into Minamata Bay, poisoning fish and ultimately the people who ate them. Several thousand people died, and many, many more suffered crippling injuries, often with severe mental and physical effects. The corporation's environmental pollution sparked legal and political battles that would last decades and reverberate throughout Japan, and indeed continue to this day. It also underscored a darker side of Japan's post-World War II economic miracle. With me to discuss the films and the insights they provide into Japanese law and society is Darryl Flaherty. Darryl is a historian of law and social change in early modern Japan. He has published work on the emergence of Japan's legal profession during the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration in world history, and the 20th century history of the jury in Japan. He's an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Delaware, where he teaches courses on Japanese, Asian, and world history. Welcome, Darryl.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's very wonderful to be here.
So just tell us a little bit about the history behind the Chisso chemical factory.
Yeah, so Chisso was actually established in 1908, started out as a synthetic fertilizer factory, and it was founded by factory president Jun Noguchi, famous for not valuing the local people. He said, treat the local people like cattle, herd animals, and, we'll do fine, we'll squeeze them, and we'll produce and contribute to, I mentioned the Japanese economic miracle. I think you're referring to the post-war period, but even in the early 20th century, the idea was, the slogan in the end of the Meiji period was rich nations, strong armies. So we need to think about the history of imperialism. So the idea was, here's an largely agricultural economy in that historical moment, but we're going to transform it into a petrochemical, heavy manufacturing economy, and we're going to imperialize Asia through that process. And so Chisso was a central company in that story. It spread out and expanded into Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and was the largest chemical manufacturer in Japan for quite a while. So it cited the company, in a sense, in this very remote location from the political center in Japan. At the time that it was cited there, just generally a remote location. You can now get to the town of Minamata more or less using the high-speed rail, the bullet train. There's now a bullet train that stops. There's a new Minamata station, and then you just transfer it to the local rail. So it's much easier to get there now, but in the time that the company opened it, this was a remote location far from the center. And that was even the case when we're talking about Minamata in the post-war period. There are scenes in the film where the activists are going to different events. They're riding on the train, and it's a long journey. They're always looking exhausted and worn out when they arrive. So that's sort of Chisso in a nutshell.
And so, and you look at right in the island of Kyushu, right, in Japan.
The southernmost island of Japan. And in a small, again, remote bay, so far from other activities. And Chisso was the factory town. Oftentimes people would say, it's consistent with a historical past when there would be the castle in the center of the town, and now there's the factory in the center of the town. And Chisso was the major employer in the town. I mean, this is a very small town. At the maximum, it was at 50,000 people resident there, and at least a quarter to a third of the population was employed by Chisso in some regard. Then there would, of course, be subcontractors and people benefit, retailers selling to Chisso employees. So the town was really beholden to Chisso. But then around the Minamata Bay are all these, sort of the folks who were living closer to the environment, fishing people and that kind of thing. And those were the folks who were largely affected by the effluent.
Yeah, I feel like the Tsuchimoto movie documentary captures sort of both those things, right? The importance of Chisso to the town, but also fishing to the life of the community. There's some really beautiful shots of fishermen at work in the Minamata Bay area.
That documentary is powerful and poignant. He's constantly juxtaposing, yes, those pictures of the water. I mean, and if you go there, I mean, it's shot in black and white, so in some ways you can't quite capture it, but you get these beautiful pictures of the fishing vessel sort of bobbing up and down in the water and the folks fishing off of that. And then there's that sort of exchange, that encounter that he has with the octopus catcher. I'm forgetting the fisherman's name, but he's this fisherman whose family members have suffered from Minamata disease, and he catches octopus in the bay. And you can tell this is a person living very close to the margins, very close to the land. And he's, capturing the octopus and putting it around his waist on this belt. And there's this very moving interlude of him sort of moving through the water, wading through the water. But yeah, you get that powerful sense of the fishing life and the fishing people. And then at the same time, you get these juxtapositions later in the film. There's this aerial shot with the voiceover of the Minamata activist standing in Kumamoto city center. And he's saying, if we care about our environment, then, we'll stand up to the corporations. You get this aerial shot of the entire factory complex, which dominates the landscape. So you have these two juxtapositions, the sort of bobbing small single vessel floating out on the water, and then that aerial shot of the factory. And also in the movie, there's a quote from a young, and it's tough. People often say fishermen because it's easy to say, but fishing folk, I think, is really what it is, because it was men and women working together. And there was a really poignant daughter who lost her father to Minamata disease, and she was saying, he knew everything. He could read the tide. He knew where the fish were. And now that he's passed away, I can't catch anything. Like she was saying, it's just a devastating loss for her, both financially, but also the emotional loss of her father. Juxtaposing both of those things, the fishing life and then the factory, and modernity against the natural village and nature. Yeah, it's important to note, as a result of effluent from the factory, there was a fishing union, mutual aid society for the fishing people, and they had confronted the factory numerous times, starting in the 1920s. So episodically, the factory, as a result of effluent, would reduce their catch, and so they would get payments. And so this sets up the context for some of the tension in both of the movies later between these people who are willing to make conciliatory settlements with the factory and then others who want to sue.
The poisoning, the mercury poisoning, that's the cause. How and when was that first discovered?
Discovered in humans, I guess we should say, first off. So there, people began to notice, the cats they called it mad cat disease. The cats were running around, falling over, salivating. Cats were dying. Cats are critical in a fishing community because they eat mice that are chewing on fishing nets. So initially people saw, the disease in the cats. And then in 1953, there were these two children, sisters, I believe, who went to the Chisso. And it's interesting, the hospital is the Chisso hospital, right? So it's really a factory town. And I've been there, and you really feel that. And you still sort of feel that, even now in the 21st century, so decades later and decades after these episodes. So they went to the factory hospital in the factory town, and the doctors didn't know what to make of it. So that was sort of 1953. By the end of the 1950s, 1959, we get the sense of, there's definitely this thing called Minamata disease. People started calling it Minamata disease. And then 1968, you get the government recognizing that methylmercury was the cause for this. But the company concealed the fact that it was doing experiments itself. And this comes up later in the court case. There's visible evidence in the community of effects from the effluent. As I mentioned, the cats. There are also birds falling out of the sky. Fisher folk in the movie talk about how, it was wonderful. The fish seemed drunk and it was easy to catch them. We were able to catch these enormous fish. And so if you were paying attention, you would notice and could see that something was wrong. And so we first see, the first patients in the 1950s, 1953, and then 1956, and that becomes more clear. And then, 1959, there was an awareness that something was seriously wrong.
And some people, right, attributed to, they thought it was like a plague, like an airborne disease or something else, right?
So it's interesting. And it's interesting in light of our recent experience with the pandemic, COVID pandemic. Initially, people did not know in the community. The company did know that it was putting mercury and many other poisons. So the company knew that its wastewater was contaminated. But they thought, their argument was that it was parts per million. This comes up both in the Levitas movie. It doesn't come up in the Tsuchimoto film, but, the sense is that, it's parts per million and it's okay. But they knew, and there were all these different theories initially, like, maybe it's cadmium poisoning, or maybe it's manganese. Or sometimes they blamed the fishermen and said, you're using different kinds of chemicals to do night fishing, and that can cause some of these symptoms. So the company obfuscated in the early phase. And also, yes, people thought, it's a contagious disease. They would sanitize the victims' homes. They would spray the victims themselves. And so the victims were ostracized. And already there was this town versus fisher people sort of dynamic. Most of the fishing people didn't live right in the town. They were from these surrounding towns, but they would shop in the town. And the Tsuchimoto movie talks about this, about how people wouldn't take their money, wouldn't touch their money. They couldn't get into cabs. The Levitas movie it's not the opening scene, but it's when Eugene Smith arrives in Minamata. And this is from testimony and appears in their book, the Minamata book by Eugene Smith and Aileen Smith, his then wife. But there's a guy carrying a corpse through the town, to someone wrapped in the sheet. If you don't look closely or you're not paying attention, you might miss it. Or if you don't know what it is, you wouldn't know what's going on there. But again, the more knowledge you have watching, particularly the Levitas movie, the more you can get out of it. And that was someone who was ostracized, probably not picked up in a cab because of the connection to Minamata disease. So yeah, it was very challenging for the people, and many people tried to hide the fact that they had it. So this was another challenge. People trying to engage in activism against the factory confronted as they tried to build a sort of critical mass response. The fishing unions had long sort of campaigned for this. They would get their pay. They would episodically go and confront the factory. But other people who were not necessarily part of the fishing union, but consumers of fish and suffering from the Minamata disease, were challenged, tried to band together, but at the same time would sometimes hide and say, oh, it's cerebral palsy, which is sometimes what the doctors at the hospital would tell them as well. And they might know in their heart of hearts. There's one episode in the Tsuchimoto film where there's an activist that goes around, and he has a Minamata disease himself. And he goes around and tries to get people to recognize that they have it and try to ask for from the government. And he goes to a mother, and he's pretty sure both the mother and the daughter have Minamata disease. The mother says, my daughter's sick. The daughter seems to have congenital Minamata disease, and she says it's cerebral palsy. And he's like, no, I don't, this is Minamata. So yeah, all kinds of challenges and ostracism and discrimination for those people who were suffering.
And it sounds like, there were different paths that people, victims and other advocates, activists took. What would they do to try to stop what was going on and to get just accountability, which would include things like reparations as well as medical care?
There's a lot in that question, and I'll unpack it a little bit. So one is just sort of what were they trying to do? So if we think about the 60s in the United States, we think about movement politics. But actually, movement politics came a little bit earlier in Japan. There was a very vibrant anti-US Japan Security Alliance Treaty in the 1950s in Japan, culminating in violent activism in 1960. There's also a peace movement against Japanese support for the United States action in the Korean War, during the Korean War. And there were all these burgeoning housewives movements in the 1950s. And so many of these kinds of groups were interested in environmental questions and the kind of pollution that one could see in other places, air pollution and other instances of pollution. Pollution was very evident in the 1950s. And so you began to see movements quite early, even well before the 1960s. And many housewives movements were, sort of laying claim to the issue and cause of environmental activism based on their maternal. They said, this is a mother's prerogative and we should protect communities. So the people suffering in Minamata, there was some coverage of that. And so there were activists from, say, Kumamoto or Kagoshima, so larger cities that were nearby, and then they would come and become involved. And then there was also the local folks, the fishing unions. So they wanted their indemnity, and they wanted the water cleaned up so they could continue fishing. As we entered the 1950s, the production of the chemical process that produced the methylmercury that went into first Minamata Bay, and then later they rerouted it, and then it went into the Minamata River. The methylmercury volume increased dramatically. So you mentioned 27,000 tons, but it began in the 1930s, 1940s, and then it really skyrocketed in the 1950s. Chisso was planning to shift production to other parts of Japan anyway. They saw this facility, it required all kinds of upgrades, and they planned to just invest elsewhere and abandon this facility was their plan initially. Ultimately, that didn't happen, but that was the company's plan. And so the activists were looking for a shutdown of the effluent, a cleaning up of the effluent. And they were also looking for some kind of money to support them. And so they engaged in different practices. There was a violent demonstration, a march from the fishing unions with some other student activists from surrounding communities. They went up to the gate. In the Tsuchimoto film, the guy almost kind of braggingly says, we didn't touch the oil refinery part or the other parts, but we could have blown the whole thing up and brought it to the ground. So you sort of got a sense of what he might have liked to have seen happen, but that doesn't happen. Then there's another group, the so-called direct negotiation group. They believe that they want to confront Chisso and get them to apologize, which is the critical thing they're looking for. And then there was another group that was willing to say, okay, we'll take a settlement. And there was sort of this sympathy money group that was willing to take a sympathy money settlement. And they entered into negotiations around that in the late 1950s and finalized an agreement. The first one was finalized in 1959. And then there were, I think, 6 or 7 more. So as new people began to be identified as sufferers of Minamata disease, some of them would go to the company and say, oh, we would like a compensation. And the company would make arrangements with them. And those initial agreements were quite small. And also the company said, oh, we're going to install a thing that, and they call it, and it's always in capital letters in the English language literature, which is sort of this techno-optimism, techno-hopefulness. The idea was that, oh, we're going to install this thing called a cyclator, capital C, and it's going to clean the water. And this is in the Levitas movie where the company manager, the Chisso manager, there's a photo of him standing there and he says, so clean, we will drink it. There's a picture of him. And that actually happened in real life. The prefectural governor of Kumamoto went to the factory and he drank water from the cyclator. Now, they had turned off the effluent pipe to the cyclator on that day because the cyclator did not remove methylmercury from the water, which they knew. So there was this big press thing. And from 1959, things quieted down from the side of folks were paid. Again, not very much. I'm forgetting the exact dollar amounts, but we're talking, I think it was like $27 or something like that for funeral expenses, minimal dollar amounts for the folks who were suffering. And they had to sign an agreement that even if it was discovered that Chisso had poisoned the water, that they wouldn't seek further damages. So that was the sort of key feature for Chisso.
For people who don't know, the Minamata disease, it's, if you see either of the movies, you look at Eugene Smith's photographs, the symptom level, I think, probably range, but when they were significant, it was a neurological disease, brutal disease, and I think congenital too.
Yeah, it's tough to capture in words. And as I've mentioned to people, I'm going to be chatting about the Minamata disease. Well, what is that? And I would say, well, it can start with, the sort of the most minor thing is to have a numbness or tingling sensation in your limbs and also in your lips, oddly enough. So that's the first sort of sign or symptom. It's progressive. So if you continue to eat and people would get sick, and then the idea was these are fishing folk, and they would just be like, oh, well, they should get more fish, give them the best fish and the biggest fish, which would be the fish with the greatest accumulation of mercury in them. And again, this is where we begin to understand these terms that are common now, but didn't exist at this time, bioaccumulation and that kind of thing. So again, it's tough to capture this tingling. Then you get narrowing of vision. Again, like as if you're looking through a tube, your vision would narrow, slurred speech, inability to walk. One of the victims talks about her husband, the skin started to slough off his back. If you're born with congenital Minamata disease, many of those children were completely disabled, sort of like locked in. They could still react to some degree. That's one of the most dramatic cases in both the Tsuchimoto film and then later in the Levitas film is the story of this young woman, Tomoko. This is the very famous photograph of Tomoko Kamimura, of the congenital Minamata victim who's being bathed by her mother. And so it's completely devastating. And the Tsuchimoto film begins with this story. Like it's all about the patients. And he begins with the patients and their experience and goes to the hospital where they're being rehabilitated. Some patients were able to be rehabilitated in the sense that they could participate in life to a degree, but others, they discussed how in comparison to someone with cerebral palsy, that the Minamata patients, they couldn't do math. There was no possibility for development. That's the kind of devastating thing about the disease.
And so the company effectively denies or tries to avoid responsibility.
Totally denied responsibility at every level. And the horrible and diabolic thing about all of this, and there's a kind of tragic figure at the heart of this, and this is why Minamata in the Japanese literature, if you think about environmental pollution cases or legal cases in Japan, it's lumped together with 3 other cases. The Minamata folks were actually the second to litigate. Well, they were the last to litigate of the 4 major pollution cases. And so the first major pollution case, litigation case, lawsuit that was brought was actually called the Niigata Minamata case. In other words, Minamata becomes the name for, in effect, the symptoms of methylmercury poisoning. But the Niigata folks were very eager to bring their case. They lived downriver from a factory, so they didn't live in the factory town. There was no division within their community. They were like, this has already been happening over here in this other place in Minamata. They actually went to Minamata to talk to the Minamata victims. And so they brought a lawsuit in 1967. So they were very early to bring a lawsuit. The Minamata lawsuit case comes 4th out of these 4 cases. So the Niigata methylmercury poisoning is the first. There was another case, which was an asthma case, which was finding a huge petrochemical, another factory site. It's called Yokkaichi. It's near Nagoya. That was another lawsuit. And then there's a suit of cadmium poisoning called in Japanese itai itai, which means it hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts disease. Cadmium poisoning makes your joints, makes your whole body ache, but particularly your joints. But the Minamata case is interesting because it has so many different elements. And one of them is, as you're saying, what about the factory response? They had a doctor working in the factory who knew and had done tests on cats where he had fed the cats food that had been laced with the effluent. And there's a very famous cat number 400. Initially, he was giving them all these other kinds of water with heavy metal in it, cadmium and these other kinds of things, manganese and whatever else. And then finally, he gave them the methylmercury and it reproduced the symptoms that they were seeing in humans. And so he concluded this is the source of the issue. This happened again in 1959. In court testimony, he said, I notified the engineers, in part to believe that within a Japanese company, they did not inform the superiors, but they stopped all investigation after that. Also, the Kumamoto University began to investigate as well. And as it became clear to others that methylmercury was the cause for this, the company engaged, along with the Chemical Association and in conjunction with both prefectural political authorities and Ministry of International Trade and Industry, all sort of engaged in this campaign of obfuscation, where they said, maybe this, one of the most outlandish claims was, these are chemicals from unexploded munitions from World War II, bombs that are lying in the bottom of the bay. That was the most outlandish claim. But other claims, again, as I've mentioned before, that it could be just some existing heavy metals in the water or some other cause. And in the other pollution cases as well, the argument was made, this is lifestyle choices. And you see this in environmental litigation, the claims that it's the person's lifestyle or some other cause that has nothing to do with the factory. So the factory denied all claims, even though it knew that it was producing methylmercury, that it was releasing it into the environment. In retrospect, there's a lot of scholarship suggesting that they absolutely would have known from a pretty early time.
We have a scene in the Levitas movie between the head of Chisso and Smith, Eugene Smith, played by Johnny Depp, where he confronts him and you can see that the Chisso head is lying and basically tries to pay Smith off to kind of crystallize this level of denial and corruption within the corporation.
I think that was for dramatic effect. I've actually looked to see if that ever happened, or if there's any evidence that ever happened, because I was really curious about that. And I've found no evidence that happened. It might have, and maybe I haven't looked firmly enough. I'm not a Eugene Smith expert, but there was definitely absolutely corruption. And the thing that did happen was that he was brutally assaulted by, they talk about company goons or company thugs. There's some question, were these company employees? Were they Japanese gangsters? Who were these people? But there's no question that he was assaulted and suffered severe damage. He lost vision in one of his eyes and suffered severe nerve damage such that he could not take pictures anymore. In the Levitas movie, he takes the famous Tomoko Kamimura picture after having been beaten. That actually happened right before for dramatic effect. But there's absolutely a level of depravity on the part of the corporation. And that's the point for Tsuchimoto and for the activists, is to really frame this as a question of, it's not just a question of torts. It's not just a question of financial compensation. They want a recognition of the sort of crimes committed both against their community, against the environment, against their idealized notion of a traditional Japan, against family life. And it's, fair enough. They say, this is a war. You have to stand up and fight. This is in the Tsuchimoto movie. This is when they go to Flower Festival in Kagoshima, which is one of the larger cities near Minamata. And there's this flower festival and they're soliciting contributions for the legal fight. And they're shouting, stand up to the corporate powers. And they're not getting a lot of traction in that scene because folks, I think, don't want to look at that. And Minamata is far from them. And so they would rather forget or not realize. But the corporation is absolutely depraved and corrupt in this story.
And then there's the government, right? You referred a little bit to it with the local prefectural authorities.
I'd love to go back to the town. So the mayor of the town during much of this episode was the guy who invented the process. It's creating acetaldehyde. He invented the process or refined the process and implemented it. He was an engineer at Chisso and then became the mayor. But he was the implementer/innovator that brought that process to the factory that created the methylmercury. And he was the mayor for at least 3 terms. So for much of this episode. So yes, it starts in the town and then to the prefecture. Sure. Yeah.
What responsibility did the government have?
So it's interesting to compare. And there was another case in Shizuoka. So as a prefecture, you had the authority and the capacity to say to companies, stop processing shut down the wastewater and we're going to do a study and then we'll proceed. And that did happen in Shizuoka, concurrent with the Minamata incident. It wasn't methylmercury poisoning, it was another episode. But there was the prefectural regulatory, there was regulatory authority in the prefecture to engage in that under existing pollution law at the time. It was the factory effluent law. It's like a 1850s, 1857 law or something like that. So there was legal authority for local folks to do that. In Kumamoto Prefecture, which is the prefecture that Minamata is located in, they did something a little different. They wrote to the government and said, what do you think we should do here? The central government. And the central government wrote back under pressure from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry that there was no clear evidence that there was a cause. They should caution people not to eat fish from the bay, but that there was no need to do a study. And the key thing about that early factory effluent law was that it required that in the regulation of factory activity that one harmonize economic interests of the national government and national state with the environmental concern. So that was one of the principles of the early law. That gets changed later in the 1967 Basic Pollution Law, which is then refined and strengthened later in 1970 in what was called the Pollution Diet. So we see a dramatic shift later once the litigation begins. But in this earlier moment, they had the authority, if they wanted to have shut down Chisso, but they wouldn't because Chisso was the major employer. Initially, Kumamoto University did research studies, but again, they had a change of president, and then the new president shut down those studies for a while. There was a lack of studying of the effects of the effluent as well. So the government was reaching in all these different areas, both in the study and then also in the regulation. So they had the authority, they didn't use it. And that was one of the infuriating things for the folks in Minamata.
Well, in Japan, right, can you explain it in terms of the close relationship between government and business?
Yeah. So it's government, business, politicians as well. So the Liberal Democratic Party was very much involved as well. And so Keidanren is the National Federation of Businesses. There's also the Chemical Producer Association. The government established committees to examine and explore these issues and set standards. And those were the parties that were on those committees. There wasn't activist representation. There weren't Minamata sufferers on those committees. And so from the 50s through the 60s, there were episodic discussions and committees to explore how to respond to pollution in Japan. And in most cases, well, in all cases, they said, we should harmonize economic interests with environmental concerns, which basically meant that economic interests came first.
And so meanwhile, the mercury is still coming in.
So in 1959, they said, we've installed this thing, the cyclator, capital C. We could drink the water out of it. It's clear. Everything's fine. We've paid you and this is the most horrifying thing of it. And the most infuriating thing, the company said, oh, everything's fine. We're going to go back to business as usual. But still people are being born with congenital Minamata. Still people are suffering from the consumption. So they also said, recommend, you don't eat the fish from the water. That was before. But then after they installed the cyclator in 1959, the idea was that the water is clean now. And they had also moved the outflow from one bay to the Minamata River. And so this was now poisoning other villages. If you understand to think about the geography, the Minamata factory is south of the Minamata River. There's a sea there called the Shiranui Sea. And then the southern part of the Shiranui Sea is this bay. That's where the major concentration was before. That was where the pipe was. The effluent flowed out of there. And then they just redirected the pipe to the north and thought, it'll be fewer parts per million if we flow it into the river. But it just diffused it into these other communities to the north now. So communities to the south. And then also further out, there's an island in the bay, and there were communities on the island as well that were affected and saw incidents.
I was struck by one of the quotes from one of the victims in the Tsuchimoto documentary, which is desire to look deep inside the state, see where it's crooked, see where it's straight, and then discover through what she hopes to discover through a trial, which I guess maybe leads into some of the litigation.
I'm laughing, smiling, because that's the series quote from the movie. That's just a powerful, powerful quote. And in a sense, though, she's saying it's a powerful indictment. She's like, I want to see where it's crooked and where it's straight. There aren't very many straight places in this story. And that she knows that. And that's the kind of heartbreak of it as well.
And so the litigation continues right into the 60s, 70s, even through today. I know there were, a couple of Supreme Court cases in 2004. So what happens with the litigation around Minamata?
So again, Minamata, the folks there, again, because of the dynamic, just to scroll it back a little bit, like why were they so reluctant? There was a powerful push against them, not just from the factory, not just from the business community, And they were ostracized and seen as contagious in the beginning, still ostracized and discriminated against after it was realized it wasn't contagious. So that even continued. But there was also a powerful movement against them from the enterprise union. The unions in Japan are called enterprise unions, so they're tied to individual company. And so the unions came out and were, demonstrating against them, active, trying to suppress any kind of litigation and pushing people into the conciliation process where Minamata was willing to pay these small dollar sums and then call it a day. And so that was a big driver of the reluctance. But in 69, they finally brought suit. A small group of folks brought suit. They derided other people. So there was the direct action folks, which I think they probably respected. I mean, those people were very confrontational. And the leader of that group, I think he goes unnamed in both the Tsuchimoto and the they all have fake names in the Levitas movie, which I think is unfortunate because we kind of know who these people are supposed to be. But the character, and it's the Sanada, the lead Japanese actor, he's supposed to be Kawamoto Teruo, who was the activist, the leader of one of the patients' groups, Direct Action Group. He was all about confronting the factory. But then we get this litigation in 1969. And so they brought a lawsuit, and the grounds was Article 709 of the Japanese Civil Code, which says if you intentionally or negligently harm someone, then you should compensate them. And so that was the legal basis. And so the critical thing in this trial was they had to prove causality, the causation of harm. Then they had to prove either negligence or intentionality. And then the other sort of legal issue was there's a statute of limitations for this matter for a tort was 3 years. So this was now well after the realization, 10 years and more after initial realization. So, did it fall within the statute of limitations? And so that was the legal case. It was brought in a Kumamoto District Court in 1969. So that was when we see the first litigation.
I mean, it's stunning, at least from a U.S. perspective, that you have this long from when, there was evidence, suspicion that it was polluting the water actually to go to court, because I guess there was the reparations process in the middle.
Yeah, that delayed it. And then there was also another process that emerged, and it gets very complicated. And people would move. I mean, it's not sort of like that you can slice everyone up into a different group like someone might. Well, there was the one group that didn't really engage in activism at all, the so-called Leave It to the Others group, and they were sort of derided. And then there were the folks who signed, starting in 1959, this is when I said there were about 6 or 7 of these agreements between different groups of people who were newly certified. And so what happened was the methylmercury was still present in the environment from 59 to 69. And people were also, this is another horrifying thing that people realized through the history of Minamata disease. People imagined or thought that the placenta was a bulwark against disease from mother to child. And it was through Minamata that medicine discovered that no, actually the placenta would concentrate the Minamata that was in the mother's body and then give it all to the child in one sort of massive dose with devastating effect. So there were continually people coming forward. I think the numbers are now that there are almost 10,000 people that have been, afflicted by Minamata, by the effects of methylmercury poisoning in Minamata Bay. And so the initial numbers were like 70, 80, 100, 110. And so we get continuing number. And so, as people came forward, it became increasingly clear that this was a big issue, a big concern, a devastating concern. And yes, the conciliation payments delayed it, but finally people brought a suit.
And does the corporation ever take responsibility?
Yeah, so the suit itself is interesting. You had the question of causality, like if we could just talk briefly about like the law itself as it was applied. The Minamata case came after, so they brought the suit in 1969 while they were suing the Niigata mercury poisoning case was resolved. And so they pretty much used the findings from that case to shape the decision in the Minamata methylmercury poisoning case. On causality, it was quite clear. Chisso was pumping methylmercury into the environment. They had determined that methylmercury was the cause for this disease. They plotted all of the cases. They had Hosokawa testified, the doctor, the sort of tragic figure. He was actually on his deathbed. And they had, this sort of ailing doctor came forward and said, yes, the Minamata was producing this and that there was a clear tie between the methylmercury poisoning and the Minamata disease. They had an engineer from the Minamata factory who came and also testified that the process created methylmercury. So for causality, it was quite clear that the court said, yes, we can see that you've caused this disease. They said there's no intentionality. So that was one finding. But then on negligence, they established a pretty high standard. They said that you're a chemical company. putting out effluent into the water. And so they said, you should pay attention to what you're doing and that we're going to hold you to a very high standard. The company said, oh, we couldn't have foreseen any of this. We didn't know. And the court said, no, no, no. We have this evidence from the doctor. We have this evidence that you knew the cyclator wouldn't remove methylmercury from the water. So the court was pretty hard and pretty damning. The verdict was very damning in relationship to Chisso on the question of negligence. The verdict said that chemical companies and factories in general have a very high standard of care to pay attention. They were like, if birds were falling out of the sky, dead fish were floating in the water. If you are the chemical factory, you have to inquire. Sort of the quote for that is, you must do continuous research, is what they said. You can't just say, oh, we did a study 20 years ago and we don't, that's fine. So they found negligence. And then on the statute of limitations, they said, well, the burden of the methylmercury poisoning and that people continually discovered the degradation of their capabilities. And so this sort of stretches out the statute of limitations and makes them culpable even to this late date. So the initial finding, 1973, was the Kumamoto District Court ruling, and it was, in a sense, a total victory for the Minamata patients. They were compensated. Again, they weren't compensated to the degree that was satisfying to them. And you often hear this, people say, oh, it's not about the money. But if you watch the documentary, you can see that it's not about the money. I mean, the documentary focuses on not the court process, but the one shareholder process for the direct negotiation movement. And those people all bought shares in Chisso Company, went to the shareholder meeting, and they wore the garb of Buddhist supplicants and Buddhist pilgrimages. They wore hats that said, we are the Minamata Sickness Pilgrimage Group. And they all sat and chanted Buddhist prayers during the shareholder meeting. And there was mayhem at the meeting. Not that they didn't create the mayhem, but their supporters, student activists, rushed in and created mayhem in the meeting. So they needed support, financial support to live and survive, but I can't say they were gladdened. It's a classic thing in Japanese court cases for someone to come out, and they do this in the Levitas film, to come out with the sign that says, we won the litigation. They pull out a scroll, it's called big character scroll, and they pull it out and it says, we won the litigation. And they do that in the Levitas movie. And there's a kind of moment, it's a sort of poignant moment in that movie, but there's no sort of celebration. As you see, one of the characters, she grabs the Chisso head of the whole corporation. She grabs him by the lapels at the shareholder meeting and screams in his face and says, you came and prayed at my family altar. You've come and stood next to me, and but you're not taking responsibility. And gets back to your question, did they ever take responsibility? Yes, they apologized after the court found so strongly against them. Then they said, yes, our bad. We apologize. They stopped putting mercury into Minamata Bay in 1968. And then their argument was, and now it's all over. The court has found against us. We're going to pay you. We apologize. Story is over. And that's it. But it wasn't it, because continually people came forward with Minamata poisoning and demanded to be certified. They were refused. The government created a pollution board that was supposed to resolve these kinds of questions. It was a little bit more stringent than people would have liked, activists would have liked. They sued again. In 1984, there was a suit against the government that said it was wrong for both Kumamoto Prefecture and Minamata not to enforce that factory effluent law that I mentioned before, under which they could have done something. And so there was a lawsuit basically saying you could have done something, and other people did. And ultimately, the court found that the government had failed to enforce that law, so there was a settlement in that case. And there are cases that continue now, mostly around certifications. If you go to Minamata, if you get off the train at Minamata Station, right in the town, and step off the train and walk down the street, one of the first buildings is a law office, and it says, we'll take up cases related to Minamata and Chisso.
So Tsuchimoto, the movie, comes out in 1971. So still, given the trajectory, sort of in the middle of all this, go on to make more films about the town, the pollution. What was the significance of his films at the time or within the overall picture of what's going on for trying to get justice and compensation?
I think it's because of Tsuchimoto that if you say Minamata to someone in Japan, they know what you're talking about. So there were, as I mentioned before, there were these 4 pollution cases. If you said Yokkaichi, I don't think someone's going to think environmental litigation or environmental law or environmental suffering. If you say Niigata, no one's going to think environmental litigation. These are the other sites where there were these famous cases. So if you say those other places, someone's not going to think, oh, pollution litigation. If you say Minamata, in Japan, everyone knows Minamata. And it's a kind of curse for the town itself. The population of the town was around 50,000. At its height in the 1950s, early 1960s, it's now dropped to 20,000. It's a problem for most small Japanese villages. Remote villages have seen depopulation. We can't say that that's just because of this story, but other places can try to marshal the lovely scenery that they have or something like that and try to turn themselves into a tourist destination. That's not a possibility for Minamata in the future. It's a lovely place. The bay is beautiful, the way the light hits the water, it's extraordinary. It's a beautiful place. And I want to stress the Levitas movie was not shot in Minamata. It's even more beautiful than the Croatian town or village or wherever they shot that. But it's just extraordinary, Minamata is. And so, but they are never going to be able to capitalize on that until this is sorted out. And it's not sorted out even now. So, I know you asked me a question in there.
Well, I was just asking about the significance of the film.
I mean, in a sense, it brought forward this issue. So now Minamata is the totemic. Like if you say Minamata, that means environmental poisoning, environmental litigation. The film did that. And then also Eugene Smith in his in the photography, brought this forward. It's right around the same time we have, Rachel Carson and people thinking about environmental movements and destruction of the environment. We mentioned Eugene Smith. We also have to mention his wife. It was a shared project. In the movie, Aileen Smith shows up and sort of seduces him into doing this Minamata photo shoot. They had actually worked together previously on an exhibit of his at the Jewish Museum in 1970. So together they sort of pitched this Minamata photo shoot project and went there together. And it was a shared project with the two of them, I would suggest. And she's still involved in environmental activism. Now you have the UN. There's the UN Convention on Methylmercury Poisoning in 2018. They held the meeting in Minamata. So, Minamata is when people think environmental poisoning, they think Minamata. So it's synonymous.
And so in Smith, he's this famed, very well-known photojournalist, right? And he's sort of idiosyncratic. He does this photo essay, which seems, like very impactful, right?
Yeah, I think in the movie, it's interesting. The movie, one of the characters says to him, people wouldn't be paying attention if you weren't here. And there is also that element. There are a lot of layers to how and whether people are going to pay attention. And there were lots of folks trying to bring attention to what was happening in Minamata in the late 60s into the early 70s. And Eugene Smith was absolutely one of them and critical in that process. And that not just the photo shoot, the spread, all those images, if you think about Minamata, they're iconic images. There's a pipe that is the pipe out of which the effluent flowed there's Minamata Bay, but then there's like a little sort of inlet, the Hyakken inlet, and that's where the pipe was flowing. And you got that photo and the photos of people's twisted hands and twisted feet and shrunken hands and feet. And, they couldn't move their bodies. And so the kind of suffering that came along with that. And he's an interesting character. Also, if you listen to the book, the movie is based on a book. The book is called Minamata. Also, it's written by Eugene Smith and Aileen Smith. It really captures the moments of joy and perseverance and happiness. Like when the folks, when they're taking, it's a sort of down moment in between soliciting support for their legal case and going to accost and challenge the company executives, they sort of relax and enjoy themselves. And there's that sort of humanity too. And Smith, it seems like, was a kind of character, idiosyncratic for sure. This kind of quirky guy who Aileen Smith described as sort of fitting into Japanese society almost seamlessly, even though he had taken photos during World War II in Okinawa as a photojournalist.
And what happens to Smith, after the essay is published?
So they stayed in Japan until from 1971 to 1974 or so together. They separated, and as a result of the separation, legally, they said that the surviving party would get copyright to all of the photographs. She had also taken a number of photographs, which appear in the book Minamata that came out, and in some of the exhibitions that they did together. And so he eventually went back to the United States. I believe she remained in Japan. She remains an activist around environmental issues, but Smith passed away in 1978. So there was the book Minamata that came out in 1975. They separated shortly after that, and then he died in 1978. I sort of playfully wrote, it's Johnny Depp playing Eugene Smith in the movie, and I sort of playfully wrote it as sort of the Jack Sparrow, like the sort of older Jack Sparrow, but the movie characterizes him, he's always drinking, but he had suffered so many injuries during the time that he was a photojournalist in wartime, and supposedly, his mouth had been exploded. He had no hard palate. He had no teeth, basically had full dentures. So he was always, evidently, according to Aileen Smith, he was always in pain. And so alcohol was just how he self-medicated. Yeah, very sympathetic. Just a very sympathetic person. I mean, he wasn't old. He was 51. I don't think of that as old at this point in my life, but and he says in the Levitas movie, my body is older than I am, which I think that was absolutely true. And then that was accelerated by the violence visited on him by the Chisso thugs, the beatdown that he received.
Yeah, it was a brutal beatdown. I mean, in both movies, right? This comes through the direct action and the violence. In one of his later movies, Tsuchimoto likens the sufferers of the Minamata poisoning to the Tokugawa era rebels
Yeah.
and their direct resistance. So I'm kind of struck by the direct resistance at the time, Japanese protests in the 60s, 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes people have this image of Japanese peoples being quiet, reserved, withdrawn, or whatever. But you'll see if you watch, particularly the Tsuchimoto documentary and the next one, they use the term iki, which means uprising. And so the people who are the victims, and this is Tsuchimoto's term, and they call themselves this, the sufferers. I mean, they are coming forward and demanding that the company managers and executives take responsibility. In the Tsuchimoto documentary itself, the guy who, the octopus catcher guy says, we should fill a keg with effluent water and make them all drink it. That's a kind of vengeance fantasy that a lot of these people, I mean, they are really, I suggested, they have these moments of joy. It's a lot of feeling. There's a lot of pathos in that movie. We see the joy and we also see the despair, the suffering, the fury. I mean, it's not just anger, it's like fury. In one of I think her name is Sakamoto Masuo, the one whose quote you cited earlier, she's on the train going up to the one shareholder meeting, and she says, I don't know what's going to happen when I get there. I might lose my mind. I mean, she does lose her mind when she gets there. When she says, I'm so upset and I can't wait to confront these guys. I might just lose it. And she does. It's interesting, I mean, thinking about the sort of social justice element and the law versus social activism and direct action. And there are a lot of scholars who've written about this in English and in Japanese, and many of them will stress the importance, and I think there is certainly an importance to create judicable precedents, and that's how the law functions. But the lawyers themselves and the people involved in these litigations, that's not the most important thing for them. The most important thing for them in this process was that they confront the executives and the executives apologize, that the executives bow down before them. And it's a very Japanese style thing to do. Make a little triangle with your hands, get down on the floor and apologize and take responsibility. I had this quote I mentioned to you before of one of the lawyers. He said, we failed in this case, not because of how much money we did or didn't get. He said, quote, in the next suit like this, whatever happens, the first rule should be to have the lawyers fully experience and appreciate the life of the plaintiffs and other residents. In other words, we should move to the town and experience the suffering that they experience in their everyday lives. And that's what a lawyer is saying. So that's kind of interesting to me. So, and the plaintiffs themselves, the sufferers, I mean, they demand that and want that out of this process.
Yeah, it seems different than some of filmic versions of mass tort litigation, for example, in the US, lawyer driven and different relationship with the community.
Yeah, I mean, this is in Tsuchimoto, that's really deliberate, I think, right? So in the Tsuchimoto movie, we see the factory, but we don't see any employee of the factory until at least the final third, if not the final quarter of the movie. They talk about it nonstop. Of course, they say what they want and they're angry and they're furious. And we see the factory in the background and the foreground, and we see the gates and we see the towers and they scream and they're shouting and we see all of that, but we don't see the company head until the shareholders meeting. And he's really, I mean, he says he has sympathy with them. He does not apologize in the Tsuchimoto movie. In the Levitas movie, we get an apology from the company head. But the true apology in the story in real life doesn't come until after the Kumamoto District Court verdict finding the company at fault. So that's what the people want. And yes, there's a fury there for sure.
To what extent, because you mentioned earlier on about sort of movement, politics, and there's an effort to have broader reform, broader environmental reform, and does what happens in Minamata through the direct action, through the litigation, produce larger reform, environmental reform beyond Minamata itself?
So I would say 100%. So there are a lot of accounts from that time saying, Japan is one of the most polluted countries in the world. There was this cooperation there was the harmonization, the so-called harmonization, which basically meant the free rein given to the companies to produce however they wanted. And so during pre-war times in Japan, these kinds of disputes were usually resolved through conciliation, but also the challenges were simpler. So there hadn't been the sort of petrochemical, the sort of second or third industrial revolution, however you want to think about it, but the petrochemical change where you get the bioaccumulation. And there also wasn't the volume in terms of asthma-inducing smog. And so In this later moment, the 50s and then in the 60s, all of that comes forward and it's inescapable in places where there are these factories. And so there were some cases where someone could institute, for example, there was a factory where there was a complaint, and then they were able to put some catchment on their smokestacks, and they were able to capture potash, which they could then use as a fertilizer. So there was a byproduct. And so it meant that their solution, like their cleanup of the dust and the particulate matter that they were producing, created something they could sell. And so the company was happy and the community was happy and everything worked out great. And so there were some cases like that in Japan. But once we get into the 50s and 60s, that's not possible. And so the political officials came to realize, and particularly this is something very savvy on the part of the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, the Conservative Party, they recognized, wow, we have to confront and challenge this issue. We have to recognize this issue. And so there was something called the pollution diet in 1970. So right around the time of all this litigation. And I would say that there's a direct causal relationship between the activism and litigation in these pollution cases, not just Minamata, but the other ones as well, because Minamata doesn't really come into full fruition until after, but the beginning of litigation, the activism of the Minamata patient sufferers, they were very evident. They had a sit-in outside the Chisso gates, it was the direct negotiation group. And they also had a tent that they put outside of the Chisso factory, Chisso headquarters in Tokyo. And so they were omnipresent and inescapable, as were other folks engaged in activism or environmental controls. And so you see the establishment, the strengthening of the basic pollution law of 1967, and then the establishment of an environmental agency within the Prime Minister's office in 1971. So you go from the sort of free reign for the factories to requirements that the chemical companies have not this nonsense cyclator thing, but you rather use a different process that doesn't produce methylmercury as a byproduct. It's more expensive, but they can produce plastics with this other process that doesn't produce methylmercury. So these kinds of transformations, and that's the shift in the early 1970s. And so there's a lot of hope and excitement. And again, it's fascinating that the LDP does that. That's a kind of very canny thing on the part of the Liberal Democratic Party. But what they do then is later, there's this moment of, oh, great, we won. Everyone's enthusiastic. People believe that there's going to be change. And then the sort of devil is in the details kind of a way. They sort of slow walk certification of new patients. The standard was to say that you had to have symptoms of Hunter-Russell syndrome, which was the definition of how do we identify whether you have Minamata poisoning or not. And you also had to have lived in these geographic areas that were affected. And so let's say your mother consumed all this methylmercury, then moved someplace else, and then you're a congenital patient, you would be denied, and then you'd have to litigate or petition. So that's where we get the litigation trail coming out, in addition to the 1984 suit against the government.
Fast forwarding a little bit ahead, then we have 2011, the accident at Fukushima, one of the worst disasters in modern Japanese history, worst nuclear incident since Chernobyl, 1986. I mean, is there anything in terms of the response to that? I mean, Minamata, in terms of Japanese law, society, mobilization?
Yes, absolutely. And so one would hope that there would have been something different. I want to go back to one of the reactions. So there has been no study to show whether Minamata Bay is clean now or not. So there was a dredging from 1980 to 1990 at great expense. They suctioned the sediment from the bottom of the bay, created a landfill, put a concrete barrier, capped it with clean soil, and then created what, sort of ironically they called Eco Park, ecology, Eco Park in English. And so why I'm bringing this up in relation to Fukushima is they also built a net. And this net was supposed to keep all of the contaminated fish. There's an enormous net that built in 1974. They're supposed to keep the contaminated fish in towards the bay. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. Like the net, it's not a very fine net. Then the fish can swim through the net. And everyone thought that this was the silliest thing ever, but this was a government reaction. And so in the Fukushima incident, there was a cloud. And so in the cloud, the government mapped the cloud, and the government's cloud, and then the cloud that the scientists mapped was very different. There was a kind of clear line for the government. So this is why I'm coming back to this net thinking. Like the government saying anything within this zone was affected negatively by radioactivity, but anything outside of this line is clean and we don't have to worry about it. And also no comprehensive study. And so folks are concerned, worried, and again, they evacuated and completely excluded the population from the so-called affected zone. But then, just across the fence, the idea was, well, this is completely contaminated, but just across this line that we've arbitrarily drawn here is totally clean. So for scientists, activists, now in the wake of Fukushima, there's a concern that lessons have not been learned. And there's also the question of covering up. Initially, folks talked about the triple disaster at Fukushima, earthquake, tsunami, and then meltdown. And then activists described actually there were four disasters. The earthquake, tsunami, meltdown, and cover up is the fourth. So there was a concern, that what has been learned, not a whole lot. And it's interesting about how lawyers aren't central to the Minamata story as it's told. I don't think there's any lawyer in the Levitas film, and in the Minamata film, there's just one moment where it's the lawyer for the Chisso company, and the sound goes silent, and we see this guy walking around in the background, and there's a little subtitle in Japanese that says, here's the Chisso head attorney, former Supreme Court justice. And in the Levitas film, no one's designated as a lawyer. And if you know the story and you've seen videos or photos of the episodes, there aren't lawyers present in the scenes that are presented in the Levitas movie. I don't think there are any lawyers in the Levitas movie. So lawyers are not present, but lawyers were absolutely present. And so that's an interesting thing for me, having written a history of lawyers, like where are the lawyers in this story? They're absolutely there. They were litigating this. I shared this quote. There's a quote from this other case, and the lawyers were absolutely present and involved, but they don't sort of figure too much as heroes, slightly as villains. So similarly now, lawyers, again, are on the ground doing extraordinary work in the Fukushima incident, trying to get compensation for people, recognition of harm from the radioactivity. But again, the story doesn't often highlight the work that they do.
Yeah, it's a very interesting contrast, I think, about the movie and filmic versions of U.S. litigation where the lawyers are sort of placed as central.
I think lawyers are always the key characters in America. Like you've done civil action, right? Or even if we think about Mark Ruffalo, Dark Waters, if we think about Aaron Brockovich, it's basically a law firm story. Any sort of filmic representation, the lawyers are the main characters, either as heroes or villains. And this is not that kind of story. I mean, the Eugene Smith story is a redemption story, personal redemption through his encounter with the victims. And they call themselves that, and that's the term that Tsuchimoto uses, the victims in their world. But I mean, they're really, I would say, survivors. I mean, these are people with perseverance. They have so much extraordinary grit. They have grace in front of this extraordinary devastation in their personal lives. And it's the encounter with that. Eugene Smith was suicidal. Aileen talks about that. Aileen Smith talks about that. And so he sort of, was given a new life through the encounter with these people and their experience, even in all of its suffering. And so that's the story that's being told, not the story of lawyers, which is too dry or too reductive, because they're trying to get out of the narrative of the materialist world. They're saying, let's get back to nature. Let's get back to another Japan that's not materialist.
And the emphasis on apology as well.
Yeah, they want something much, much more than you can get in a courtroom. And we didn't mention this. I mean, Chisso has been required to make extraordinary payments. I believe one of the estimates is about $80 million. And what's happened is the government has basically subsidized Chisso in order for it to make these payments. And so it's this kind of strange thing. Like basically the principle in the revised basic pollution law is that the polluter pays. And so that was one of the features coming out of the 1970 pollution diet, was that the polluter will pay. But in reality, the taxpayer pays because the government subsidized Chisso through all kinds of loans and tax forbearance and all this kind of thing. And so in the end, in part, the taxpayer pays. So that's another kind of weird, twisted thing. I mean, Chisso is still present, still functioning in Minamata. If it wasn't there, there would be nothing in Minamata in terms of industry. It doesn't pollute the bay anymore, but they haven't done a study. And so no comprehensive study. There have been some studies, but they're all very piecemeal. And many of them show that the methylmercury concentrations are still quite high in Minamata Bay, worryingly high. So the bay has been dredged, but it's not fully clean. And so
that's frightening.
It's a huge concern. And also there's still a resistance for people to say, I'm suffering from methylmercury poisoning. So there's this idea that the chapter's closed. The town would like to close the chapter. Chisso would like to close the chapter. And it's interesting, there's a government-supported museum there And it's kind of like, oh, the world can learn, and we are on the frontier of understanding and explaining methylmercury poisoning and bioaccumulation. And we're done with this, and now we will teach you. But at the same time, there continue to be people who say, oh, I suffer as a result of methylmercury in the bay.
The degree of activism in Japan today seems much less than it was in the
Yeah.
70s.
Dramatic reduction. So coming out of World War II, there was this, I mean, this is me as a historian talking now, and it'll interrupt any moment. But coming out of World War II, there were all the promises of rights in the new Constitution. And so it was this moment of possibility, and people felt like they should seize that moment. But during the occupation, there was also the so-called reverse course, so where the United States government rehabilitated folks who were conservatives, some war criminals, and so on. And that was the beginning of the Liberal Democratic Party and conservatism and that kind of thing. So there was this tension, and it really came to a head in 1960 with the riots around the Diet Building against the US-Japan Security Alliance. And so I would say from 1945 through that moment, there was a kind of combustibility about Japanese society, I would suggest. And there was a lot of engagement, a lot of street politics. And it was in the language of citizen, like Shimin Dantai. One of the Minamata groups is the citizens committee from the town that felt guilty. It gets very complicated. I mean, there were many, many different groups and subgroups and factions or whatever. But there's one group, they felt guilty, the town people who felt guilty that they had stood by and not engaged. And so they took on this mantle, and they were called the Minamata Shimin. They weren't victims, they weren't sufferers, but they were like allies is what we would call them, I guess, in the 21st century. So there were all these kinds of different groups, and all overlapping and engaged and tied up to the Socialist and Communist Party, which I also didn't mention, but that's the Socialist and Communist Party were funding a lot of the lawyer groups. But the patients groups often doubted, sort of suspected them. They were suspicious of their involvement. When you walk down the street, there's first that lawyer's office, then there's a social services thing run by the Communist Party affiliated social services office, and then there's a Catholic Church. And there is faith also, Buddhism we could have talked about, but it was very combustible in lots of movements, not at all now. I mean, if you were engaged in a movement activity like that, and even in that moment, so after 1960, though, people begin to move towards what we think of as Japan now. And that's what philosopher, social critic, a guy named Hidaka Rokuro described as economism. In other words, comfort and the desire to live in material comfort. And so people just sort of say, oh, that's not my problem, and walk down the street. In Tsuchimoto, you see they're on that street, and there's the flower festival, and they're shouting, and no one's putting money in their box, and everyone's walking by them or walking around them. And it captures, that's like the general reaction to shimin, in other words, citizen movements in Japan after. Like, everyone suffered environmental pollution. It's something that everyone experienced more broadly, and people were like, yeah, we should address this. And then after there was the pollution diet, some controls, the most obvious sources were controlled or limited. Then people are like, okay, it's solved. Now we can get on with it and enjoy increasing incomes. Summing up, what Tsuchimoto wants to talk about is about the victims and about their experience. And they're kind of extraordinary people if you watch. And he's sort of saying, we shouldn't pity them. They have lives. They should be valued. They're human. And so to try to restore some of that humanity, I think for a Japanese audience, there's a lot of discrimination in Japan and in the rest of the world as well towards people who have mental or physical disabilities. And he's saying we should cherish these people and value them beyond just the financial value. They're important parts of the community, of their family, and so to celebrate that. And I think what the Smith movie shows is, on the one hand, is trying to make a point about universal suffering. At the end, it's kind of photo montage of all these other environmental cases, tragedies around the world. But for me, I think it works best as a movie about the kind of redemption of Eugene Smith, this figure who's, yes, at the end, towards the end of his career. And his whole thing, I mean, it's in his book, it comes out in the movie. Aileen Smith, in a later interview, talks about this. She says, he felt like he had obligation to both the viewer and the subject of his photographs. And that was his whole thing. That was his philosophy of photography. And I think the movie sort of captures that, and that kind of idealism that was typical of that time, the 1960s, early 1970s. And the movie brought forward thinking about this kind of thing again. And I think that's the Levitas movie. That's also a contribution.
Yeah, and they both through the Tsuchimoto documentary, actually of the documentary, and then the Levitas movie, not so much the movie itself, but the photo journalism that was the subject of the movie. Yeah. Interesting to see the role of the documenting can play in these types of situations.
Yeah, I mean, they're both stories about storytelling. And so even Tsuchimoto, it's a story about storytelling, but where he lets the people tell this, like he's listening, he lets the people tell their stories. And so the people are then do tell their stories. I mean, there was that young boy who likes watching TV, and then a woman, maybe it's his mother, she says to him, what about you? What about your future when you grow up? And it's a very poignant scene. He says, in Japanese, he says, dame, dame, sayonara. And that means it's bad, goodbye. And so you have this feeling of, I mean, he's such a energetic kid. I mean, it's just this young kid, and he doesn't have control over his body. He can barely sit up. He can barely, his speech is very slurred. You can see that he has some sort of mental impairment, but he's able to communicate. He's alive. He has enthusiasms. And so where the movies sort of bring forward these personalities, they're really powerful. And I thought in the Levitas movie, it opens when they arrive in Minamata. The movie doesn't open. I mean, if we talk about the opening, I thought it was a very clever opening of the movie. There's the live performance of Tomoko being bathed by her mother in the movie. Her name is Akiko. And it turns out, I learned later, listening to this interview with Eugene Smith, that she was bathed almost twice a day. So she was bathed all the time. So although that was sort of staged, she was bathed a lot, and so we get the water of her being splashed around in the water, and then it sort of transitions into the chemicals which Smith is using to develop the film, which then we learn later, and this is true, or not perhaps the chemicals, exact chemicals used, but those kinds of chemicals are produced by Chisso. Again, that's why I'm saying the more you know about it, the more you can appreciate. And I'm quite certain that the director, that's not by accident that the movie opens that way. And so I thought that was very powerful. And then when we get to Minamata, it's almost one of these sort of truth is stranger than fiction sort of scenes. There's this guy playing an accordion, and I thought that was they were taking liberty. I hadn't seen it in the Tsuchimoto documentary, that this guy standing there playing an accordion. And it turns out there was a Minamata patient who played the accordion and would go walk around the community and play the accordion. It seemed almost like a sort of absurdist Italian movie or something. And I was like, what's going on here? So there was that as well. So trying to bring forward the poignancy of these people's experiences, that both movies do that in powerful ways.
I would highly recommend, that people see both movies. You can see the Tsuchimoto movie it's available on the internet, like a film archive site, which will provide, if you set your settings right, a translation to English. And then the Minamata is available for streaming on various sites. Yeah, I think they're both really well done. They provide fascinating insight to what happened in Minamata into Japan. And I think, as you said, kind of surprising and contrary to ideas that people have about Japan and Japanese society.
Yeah, I mean, people taking action to confront injustice that they see in their everyday life at enormous risk to their social standing, mostly because they feel like they have no choice.
Darryl, thanks so much for coming on. Great to have you, and just your vast expertise on this subject. It's terrific to talk with you about both movies.
Jonathan, thanks so much. I teach Minamata, actually. I do a post-World War II class called Post-War Japan. So I've taught this film many times. So when you mentioned it, I was excited, and I was delighted to be asked before I went to Japan over the summer, because I wouldn't have, to confess, I would not have gone to Minamata otherwise. But going there, that really, I mean, it was powerful to walk the streets of Minamata and see just how it's still struggling to overcome this episode.